October 3rd, 1993, 16:20 hours. Mogadishu, Somalia. Master Sergeant Gary Ivan Gordon, 33 years old, from Lincoln, Maine, was positioned in the open door of a UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter circling 1,000 feet above the most dangerous city in the world. He was scanning the streets through the scope of his M14 rifle, providing sniper overwatch for American soldiers fighting in the streets below. Gordon was a member of Delta Force, the Army's most elite counterterrorism unit. He had been in special operations for over a decade. He had conducted missions in dozens of countries. He was one of the best long-range marksmen in the entire U.S. military. Sitting next to him in the same helicopter was Sergeant First Class Randall David Shughart, 35 years old, from Newville, Pennsylvania. Shughart was also Delta Force, also a sniper, also one of the best shooters the Army had ever produced. The two men had worked together for years. They knew each other's capabilities perfectly. For the past 48 minutes, Gordon and Shughart had been watching an operation that was supposed to take 30 minutes turn into a disaster. What was planned as a quick raid to capture two of Warlord Mohammed Farah Ada's lieutenants had become an urban battle involving hundreds of Somali militia fighters armed with AK-47s and rocket-propelled grenades. Two American Black Hawk helicopters had already been shot down. Dozens of soldiers were pinned down in the streets, fighting for their lives. And now, at 16:20 hours, Gordon and Shughart were watching a third Black Hawk, call sign Super 64, piloted by Chief Warrant Officer Mike Durant, spinning out of control after taking an RPG hit to the tail rotor. Super 64 crashed in a residential area approximately 1 mile from the target building. The helicopter went down in the middle of a Somali militia stronghold, surrounded by thousands of armed fighters who were already converging on the crash site. Gordon got on the radio to the command helicopter. His voice was calm, professional. "I need to go to that crash site." The answer came back immediately. "Negative. Too dangerous. Ground convoy is en route." But Gordon and Shughart could see what the command helicopter couldn't. The ground convoy was pinned down, taking heavy fire, nowhere near the crash site. The Somali militia was closing in on Super 64 from every direction. The crew inside a helicopter, if any had survived the crash, had minutes before they would be overrun and killed. Gordon made the request again. Request permission to insert at crash site Super 64. Again, negative. Denied. Gordon looked at Shughart. They both knew what was happening. Mike Durant and his crew were going to die unless someone reached them in the next few minutes. The ground convoy wasn't going to make it in time. The command helicopter didn't have the authority to approve what Gordon was asking for. Gordon keyed his radio a third time. Request permission to insert at Super 64 crash site. The answer was the same. Negative. Too high risk. Gordon and Shughart exchanged a look. They both understood the mathematics perfectly. If they inserted at that crash site, if they jumped from this helicopter into the middle of a militia-held neighborhood with thousands of armed Somalis, they would be surrounded within minutes. They would be outnumbered by hundreds to one. They would run out of ammunition. Eventually, they would die. But Mike Durant would have a chance to survive long enough for the convoy to reach him. Gordon made the request a fourth time. His voice was steady, showing no emotion. Request permission to insert at crash site Super 64 to defend survivors. There was a long pause. Then, permission granted. God be with you. Gordon and Shughart checked their weapons. M14 rifles, CR-15 carbines, pistols, fragmentation grenades. They had approximately 200 rounds of ammunition total between them. They were about to face an enemy force that numbered in the thousands. The Black Hawk descended towards Super 64's crash site. Gordon and Shughart prepared to jump. This is the story of the Battle of Mogadishu, the 18-hour firefight that became known as Black Hawk Down. The story of how a 30-minute raid turned into the deadliest urban combat involving American forces since Vietnam. The story of how Task Force Ranger, 160 elite soldiers from Delta Force and the 75th Ranger Regiment, fought through the streets of Mogadishu against thousands of armed Somalis. But most importantly, this is the story of two men who volunteered for certain death because it was the only way to give one pilot a chance at life. Two snipers who knew exactly what they were doing when they jumped from that helicopter. Two Delta operators who made a decision that would earn them both a Medal of Honor, awarded posthumously, because neither man survived the afternoon. This is a story of Master Sergeant Gary Gordon and Sergeant First Class Randy Shughart, who proved that sometimes the greatest courage isn't fighting when you think you might win. It's fighting when you know you're going to die, but someone else's survival depends on you buying them time with your life. Somalia in October 1993 was a failed state in the midst of a humanitarian catastrophe. Warlords controlled different sections of Mogadishu, the capital city. Rival militias fought each other for territory and resources. The United Nations had deployed peacekeeping forces to protect food aid from being stolen by the warlords, but the peacekeepers were ineffective. Somali civilians were starving while the warlords grew rich from controlling food distribution. The most powerful warlord was Mohammed Farah Aidid, who controlled southern Mogadishu and commanded militia of thousands of fighters. In June 1993, Aidid's forces had ambushed and killed 24 Pakistani UN peacekeepers. The UN issued a warrant for Aidid's arrest. The United States deployed Task Force Ranger, a joint special operations unit, to capture Aidid and dismantle his organization. Task Force Ranger consisted of 160 men, operators from Delta Force, the Army's counterterrorism unit, Rangers from the 75th Ranger Regiment, Elite Light Infantry, pilots from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, and support personnel. They were based at Mogadishu Airport, operating in hostile territory, where every Somali civilian could potentially be a militia fighter. The mission was straightforward: conduct raids to capture Aidid's lieutenants and key supporters, eventually capturing Aidid himself. The tactics were always the same. Rangers would fast row from helicopters onto the target building, capture the targets, and hold the position. A ground convoy of Humvees would drive to the building, load the prisoners in the assault force, and drive back to base. The operations were planned to take 30 minutes maximum. Get in fast, get out fast, minimize exposure. Between August and October 1993, Task Force Ranger had conducted 6 successful raids using this template. They had captured multiple Aidid lieutenants. The operations had gone smoothly. The Somali militia had learned to fear the sound of Black Hawk helicopters, but the militia was learning, adapting. They were acquiring more rocket-propelled grenades, RPGs, from arms dealers. They were learning that helicopters could be shot down if you fired enough RPGs at them, and they were getting bolder. October 3rd, 1993, started like any other day at the airport base. Task Force Ranger had conducted morning physical training, equipment maintenance, intelligence briefings. They were on standby, waiting for actionable intelligence on Aidid's location or the whereabouts of his top lieutenants. At 1500 hours, intelligence reported a meeting of Aidid lieutenants at the Olympic Hotel in the Bakara Market District, the heart of Aidid's territory, the most dangerous neighborhood in Mogadishu. The decision was made: launch a raid immediately while the targets were still at that location. The assault force loaded onto helicopters at 1520 hours. The mission followed the standard template. 12 Black Hawks would carry the assault force to target. 4 MH, 6 Little Birds would provide close air support. 2 Black Hawks would carry Delta snipers for aerial overwatch. The ground convoy, 12 vehicles, 70 Rangers and Delta operators, would drive from the airport to the target building after the assault force secured it. Master Sergeant Gary Gordon was assigned to Super 62, one of the sniper Overwatch helicopters. His job was to provide precision fire from the air, taking out militia fighters who threatened the assault force on the ground. Sergeant First Class Randy Shughart was also assigned to Super 62. He would work alongside Gordon, both men firing from opposite sides of the helicopter, covering different sectors of the battlefield below. Gordon and Shughart were both members of Delta Force's sniper element. Delta snipers were different from conventional military snipers. They didn't spend days lying in concealment, waiting for a single shot. They were offensive snipers, trained to move quickly through urban terrain, engage multiple targets rapidly, operate in close coordination with assault teams. They were experts at precision shooting under stress. Gordon had joined the Army in 1978. He had served in the Special Forces Green Berets before being selected for Delta Force in 1986. He was quiet, professional, intensely focused on his craft. Fellow operators described him as the kind of soldier who never sought attention, but was always the first to volunteer for the most dangerous missions. He was married to Carmen Gordon and had 2 children. Shughart had joined the Army in 1976. He had also served in Special Forces before Delta selection. He was known for his calm demeanor under fire and his exceptional marksmanship. His fellow Delta operators said that Shughart could make shots that seemed impossible, hitting targets at extreme range in difficult conditions under stress. He was married to Stephanie Shughart and had 2 children. Both men had deployed to Mogadishu in August 1993 with the rest of Task Force Ranger. They had participated in all 6 previous raids. They knew Mogadishu streets, knew the patterns of Somali militia tactics, knew how quickly situations could deteriorate in urban combat. At 15:32 hours, the helicopters took off from the airport. 12 Black Hawks and 4 Little Birds flew in formation toward the Olympic Hotel, 2 miles from the airport. The flight took 3 minutes. The assault force could see Somali civilians looking up, pointing at the helicopters. By the time the Black Hawks reached the target building, the entire neighborhood knew American forces were coming. At 15:40 hours, the assault began. Rangers fast roped from the Black Hawks onto the streets surrounding the Olympic Hotel. Delta operators cleared the building room by room. The targets, 2 of Ada's lieutenants and 22 other militia members, were captured within 7 minutes. So far, the operation was proceeding perfectly. The ground convoy left the airport at 15:42 hours, heading toward the Olympic Hotel to pick up the assault force and the prisoners. But the Somali militia was responding faster than in previous raids. Hundreds of fighters armed with AK-47s were moving toward the Olympic Hotel from every direction. The Rangers on the ground were taking fire from multiple positions: rooftops, windows, alleyways. The militia was using civilians as shields, making it difficult for the Americans to return fire without risking civilian casualties. The ground convoy was taking heavy fire as it drove through the streets. Multiple vehicles were hit by RPGs. Several Rangers and Delta operators were wounded. The convoy was moving slowly, having to fight through ambushes at every intersection. Gordon and Shughart, circling overhead in Super 62, were engaging militia fighters from the air. The M14 rifle Gordon was using fired 7.62 millimeters NATO rounds, powerful enough to penetrate walls and vehicles. At 1,000 feet altitude, with the helicopter moving, hitting man-sized targets on the ground required extraordinary skill. Gordon was making those shots consistently, taking out militia fighters who were threatening the Rangers below. Shughart was doing the same from the opposite side of the helicopter, his rifle shots dropping militia fighters who were setting up RPG ambushes. At 16:20 hours, the situation changed completely. Super 61, a Black Hawk piloted by Chief Warrant Officer Cliff Walcott, was hit by an RPG. The rocket struck the tail rotor, severing the drive shaft. Walcott tried to maintain control, but a helicopter without a tail rotor cannot be flown. Super 61 spun violently and crashed in a residential area 6 blocks from the Olympic Hotel. The ground convoy immediately changed mission. Instead of picking up the assault force at the Olympic Hotel, they would now have to fight through the Super 61's crash site to rescue the crew. But the convoy was already engaged in heavy combat. Moving to the crash site would require fighting through some of the most militia-heavy streets in Mogadishu. From their position overhead, Gordon and Shughart watched as hundreds of Somali militia fighters converged on Super 61's crash site. The crew inside the helicopter, Walcott and 3 others, were injured in the crash. They were trapped in the wreckage, unable to defend themselves effectively. Then at 16:27 hours, disaster compounded disaster. Super 64, another Black Hawk, piloted by Chief Warrant Officer Mike Durant, was hit by an RPG. The rocket struck the tail boom, destroying the tail rotor. Durant tried to auto-rotate the helicopter down, searching for any open space to crash land. There was none. Mogadishu was densely packed with buildings, narrow streets, walls, and obstacles. Durant crashed Super 64 in a residential area approximately 1 mile southwest of the Olympic Hotel, even farther from friendly forces than Super 61. Gordon and Shughart watched Super 64 go down. They could see the helicopter's rotors still spinning as it hit the ground. They could see dust and debris thrown up by the impact. They could see dozens, then hundreds, of Somali militia fighters running toward the crash site. And they could see that the ground convoy, still fighting its way to Super 61, was nowhere near Super 64. Mike Durant was alone, surrounded, with thousands of armed militia fighters closing in. Gordon keyed his radio. Request permission to insert at Super 64 crash site. Chief Warrant Officer Mike Durant was unconscious for approximately 30 seconds after Super 64 crashed. When he came to, he was hanging upside down in his seat harness, the helicopter lying on its right side. His back was broken, a compression fracture of the lumbar vertebrae from the impact. His right leg was broken, tibia and fibula shattered. Blood was running down his face from cuts on his head. The crash had been violent but not catastrophic. Super 64's airframe was mostly intact. The crew compartment had held together, But the helicopter was immobilized, lying in an alley surrounded by buildings on all sides. Durant's co-pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Raymond Frank, was dead. The impact had killed him instantly. The two crew chiefs, Staff Sergeant William Cleveland and Staff Sergeant Thomas Field, were both alive but injured. They were already climbing out of the wreckage, weapons ready, preparing to defend the crash site. Durant tried to move and discovered his legs wouldn't respond. The broken back had caused nerve damage. He couldn't feel anything below his waist. He was trapped in the pilot's seat, unable to climb out. Cleveland and Field took up defensive positions near the helicopter. They could hear voices, hundreds of voices, shouting in Somali, getting closer. The militia knew exactly where Super 64 had crashed. They were converging from every direction. Cleveland shouted to Durant, "We're about to have company." Durant reached for his MP5 submachine gun, checking the chamber. He had approximately 90 rounds of ammunition total, 3 30-round magazines. If the militia overran the helicopter, that ammunition wouldn't last long. 1 mile away, in Super 62, Gary Gordon was making his first request to insert at Durant's crash site. The command structure for Task Force Ranger was split between multiple locations. Major General William F. Garrison, the overall commander, was at the Joint Operations Center at the airport, watching video feeds from surveillance aircraft circling above Mogadishu. He could see both crash sites, could see the militia converging, could see the ground convoy fighting in the streets. The tactical decisions, which units to commit where, which risks to take, were being made by officers in the command helicopters orbiting above the battle. These officers could see the battlefield, but couldn't see everything. They were trying to manage a situation that was deteriorating by the minute. When Gordon made his first request to insert at Super 64, the answer was immediate. Negative. The reasoning was sound from a command perspective. The ground convoy was supposed to reach Super 64 eventually. Inserting 2 Delta operators into a surrounded crash site would add 2 more people who would need rescue. It would complicate the situation rather than solving it. But Gordon and Shughart could see what the command helicopters couldn't fully appreciate. The ground convoy was barely moving. They were taking casualties. They were lost. The streets of Mogadishu were a maze, and the drivers were having trouble navigating. At the rate they were moving, they wouldn't reach Super 64 for 30 minutes minimum. Durant and his crew didn't have 30 minutes. At 16:29 hours, 2 minutes after Super 64 crashed, the first Somali militia fighters reached the crash site. Cleveland and Field opened fire with their M16 rifles. The militia fighters took cover behind walls and in doorways, returning fire with AK-47s. The battle for Super 64 had begun. From 1,000 feet above, Gordon could see the entire tactical picture. He could see militia fighters moving through the streets toward Durant's position. He could see the ground convoy stuck in an ambush 6 blocks away. He could see that nobody was going to reach Super 64 in time. He made his second request. Request permission to insert at Super 64 crash site. Again, negative. Too high risk. Randy Shughart was listening to the radio traffic. He knew exactly what Gordon was thinking, because he was thinking the same thing. They were watching 3 men about to be overrun and killed. The command helicopters couldn't authorize them to insert, because it would mean sending 2 men into a situation where death was nearly certain. But death was absolutely certain for Durant, Cleveland, and Field if nobody went. Gordon looked at Shughart. They didn't need to discuss it. They both knew what had to be done. At 16:31 hours, the firefight at Super 64 intensified. Dozens of militia fighters were now engaging Cleveland and Field from multiple directions. The 2 crew chiefs were firing carefully, conserving ammunition, trying to hold off an enemy force that numbered in hundreds. Inside the helicopter, Durant was still trapped in his seat, trying desperately to free himself. His broken back made every movement agony. His broken leg was useless. He could feel the helicopter shaking from bullets hitting the airframe. Cleveland shouted, "We can't hold them much longer." Gordon made his third request. Request permission to insert at Super 64 crash site to provide ground defense. The command helicopter was silent for several seconds. The officers were calculating risks, trying to determine if there was any other option. The ground convoy was still fighting its way through ambushes. No other units were close enough to help. The answer came back. Negative. Cannot approve insertion. Shughart spoke for the first time on the radio. His voice was calm, matter of fact. Those men are going to die if we don't go in. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of tactical reality. At 16:33 hours, Staff Sergeant William Cleveland was shot. A 7.62 millimeters round from an AK-47 struck him in the chest, penetrating his body armor. He fell near the helicopter's tail boom. Staff Sergeant Thomas Field dragged him behind cover and tried to stop the bleeding. But Cleveland's wound was fatal. He died within 2 minutes. Field was now alone, defending the crash site by himself, firing at militia fighters who were advancing from 3 directions simultaneously. His ammunition was running low. The militia was getting closer. Inside the helicopter, Durant finally managed to free himself from the seat harness. He fell at the side of the fuselage, his broken back and legs sending waves of pain through his body. He crawled toward the crew compartment door, his MP5 submachine gun clutched in one hand. He could see Field firing, reloading, firing again. He could see the growing number of militia fighters surrounding the helicopter. He knew what was coming. At 16:34 hours, Gary Gordon made his 4th request. His voice was calm, showing no emotion, stating facts. Request permission to insert at crash site Super 64 to defend survivors. We are running out of time. There was a long pause. The command helicopter officers were weighing an impossible decision. If they approved the insertion, they would be sending 2 men to almost certain death. If they didn't approve it, Durant and Field would be killed or captured within minutes. Finally, at 16:35 hours, the answer came. Super 62, you are cleared to insert at crash site Super 64. God be with you. Gordon acknowledged. Roger. We're going in. The pilot of Super 62, Chief Warrant Officer Michael Gafina, began descending towards Super 64's crash site. He was about to attempt one of the most dangerous insertions in special operations history, landing a Black Hawk in the middle of a militia-controlled neighborhood where hundreds of armed fighters were converging on a single location. Gordon and Shughart prepared their equipment. They checked their weapons systematically, professionally, showing no signs of stress. M14 rifles with spare magazines are, 15 carbines, pistols for fragmentation, grenades, medical supplies. They had approximately 200 rounds of rifle ammunition total between them. They were about to face an enemy force numbering in the thousands. The mathematics were simple and fatal. Randy Shughart looked at Gary Gordon. According to account from other Delta operators in Super 62, Shughart said quietly, "Good luck." Gordon replied, "See you on the other side." Neither man expected to survive the next hour. They were inserting anyway because Mike Durant's survival depended on someone reaching him before militia overran the crash site. At 16:36 hours, Super 62 descended through increasingly heavy ground fire towards Super 64's crash site. Gafina couldn't land directly at the helicopter because there was no space. The crash site was surrounded by buildings and walls. He touched down approximately 100 meters south of Super 64 in a slightly more open area. The moment the Black Hawk's wheels hit the ground, Gordon and Shughart jumped out. The helicopter lifted off immediately, disappearing into the sky. Gordon and Shughart were alone on the ground in the middle of Mogadishu, surrounded by hostile forces. With no support and no extraction plan, they began moving towards Super 64's crash site. Gary Gordon and Randy Shughart moved through the streets of Mogadishu the way Delta operators were trained to move through hostile urban terrain. Quickly but carefully, using cover, checking corners, weapons ready, scanning for threats. The distance from their insertion point to Super 64's crash site was approximately 100 meters, 1 city block. Under normal circumstances, that distance could be covered in 30 seconds. But circumstances were anything but normal. The streets were full of Somali militia fighters moving toward the helicopter. Gordon and Shughart could hear hundreds of voices shouting, weapons firing, the sound of a mob converging on a target. They moved parallel to the main street rather than walking directly down it. They used alleyways, moved along walls, stayed in shadows. They were trying to reach Durant before the main militia force did. At 16:38 hours, 2 minutes after inserting, Gordon and Shughart reached the perimeter of Super 64's crash site. They could see the helicopter lying on its side, could see Staff Sergeant Thomas Field firing from behind limited cover, could see dozens of militia fighters attempting to approach the crash site from multiple directions. Gordon took up a position that gave him fields of fire covering the northern approach to the helicopter. Shughart moved to cover the eastern approach. They began engaging the militia fighters with precision rifle fire. The M14 rifle Gordon was using was a semi-automatic weapon capable of accurate fire out to 800 yards. In an urban environment with targets at ranges of 50 to 200 yards, the M14 was devastating. Gordon began systematically shooting militia fighters who were attempting to advance on the helicopter. Shughart was doing the same from his position, his rifle fire dropping militia fighters who were trying to flank the crash site. The militia's advance faltered. They had been moving forward aggressively, believing they were overwhelming a small, isolated group of Americans. Suddenly, they were taking precision rifle fire from unexpected directions. Men were falling. The Americans had been reinforced. Field saw Gordon and Shughart arrive. He shouted, "2 more coming in." Inside the helicopter, Mike Durant heard Field's voice and understood. Someone had reached them. Help had arrived. But Durant was a pilot. He understood helicopters, understood tactical situations. He knew that Super 62 hadn't landed at the crash site. He would have heard it, which meant Gordon and Shughart had inserted some distance away and fought their way to the helicopter on foot, which meant they had voluntarily inserted into a surrounded position with no extraction plan, which meant they were here to die, buying Durant time to survive. Gordon reached the helicopter at 1640 hours. He moved quickly to the crew compartment door where Durant was lying, still trapped by his injuries, his MP5 ready but his mobility zero. Gordon looked at Durant. According to Durant's later account, Gordon's first words were, "Are you injured?" Durant replied, "My back's broken, legs broken. I can't move." Gordon assessed the situation immediately. Durant couldn't walk. They couldn't carry him and fight simultaneously. The only option was to hold this position and hope the ground convoy reached them before they were overrun. Gordon made a decision that would save Mike Durant's life. He gave Durant his personal weapon, his AR-15 carbine, along with several magazines of ammunition. Durant looked at the weapon, looked at Gordon. "What about you?" Gordon already had his M14 rifle. "I'll be fine. You need this more than I do." It was a lie. Gordon knew he would need every weapon and every round of ammunition he possessed. But he also knew that Durant, immobilized in a helicopter, needed a weapon more than Gordon did. If the militia overran their position, Durant would be the last one fighting. He would need that rifle. Gordon moved back to his firing position. He, Shughart, and Field formed a defensive perimeter around the helicopter. They were 3 men, 4 if you counted Durant, who couldn't move, facing hundreds of armed militia fighters. The militia was learning that frontal assaults on the helicopter were suicide. Gordon and Shughart were too accurate, too professional. Every militia fighter who tried to rush the helicopter was shot before getting close. So the militia changed tactics. They began firing from windows and rooftops, trying to hit the defenders without exposing themselves to the devastating rifle fire. They threw grenades, trying to wound the Americans with fragmentation. They used civilians as shields, making it difficult for Gordon, Shughart, and Field to engage without risking civilian casualties. At 1645 hours, Staff Sergeant Thomas Field was hit. A burst of AK-47 fire struck him in the torso, multiple rounds penetrating his body armor. He fell near the helicopter's nose section. Gordon moved to his position, returning fire, trying to suppress the militia fighters who had shot Field. But Field's wounds were fatal. He died within minutes. The second crew chief killed defending Super 64. Now it was just Gordon and Shughart, 2 Delta snipers. Approximately 150 rounds of ammunition remaining between them, facing hundreds of militia fighters who were growing bolder as they realized the defenders were running low on ammunition. From his position inside the helicopter, Durant could hear the sound of Gordon's and Shughart's rifles firing methodically. He could hear the incoming fire, the distinctive crack of AK-47 rounds passing overhead, the explosions of grenades, the shouts of the militia fighters. He knew Gordon and Shughart were going to die. He knew they knew it too, and they were fighting anyway, buying him time with their lives. At 1650 hours, the militia began a coordinated assault from multiple directions simultaneously. Dozens of fighters advanced on a helicopter from the north, east, and south, firing as they moved, trying to overwhelm the 2 defenders with sheer numbers. Gordon and Shughart engaged targets as fast as they could acquire them. Their rifle fire was precise, controlled, professional. Militia fighters fell. The assault faltered, but the militia kept coming. For every fighter Gordon shot, 3 more appeared. They were using human wave tactics, accepting casualties to close the distance. Gordon's M14 ran dry. He reloaded his last magazine. Shughart was down to his final magazine. They had perhaps 2 minutes of ammunition remaining. At 1655 hours, Randy Shughart was shot. The details of exactly how he was killed are unclear. Multiple accounts exist, none completely certain. What is known is that Shughart was hit by rifle fire, fell near the helicopter's tail section, and died within moments. Gary Gordon was now alone. One man, one rifle magazine, approximately 20 rounds of ammunition, facing hundreds of militia fighters who were now rushing the helicopter from every direction, knowing the Americans were nearly out of ammunition. Gordon continued fighting. He moved positions, trying to cover all approaches to the helicopter. He fired carefully, making every shot count. Militia fighters fell, but more took their places. His rifle ran empty. He drew his pistol. According to Mike Durant's account, the only American eyewitness who survived, Gordon fought until he ran out of pistol ammunition. Then he drew a knife. At approximately 16:58 hours, Gary Gordon was shot and killed defending Super 64's crash site. The exact details of his death are unknown. What is certain is that he fought until he was overwhelmed by numbers, until he had no ammunition remaining, until he physically could not fight anymore. He died doing exactly what he volunteered to do. Buy Mike Durant time to survive. With Gordon and Shughart dead, the militia overran the crash site. They pulled Mike Durant from the helicopter. They beat him with rifle butts, breaking additional ribs. They dragged him through the streets. But they didn't kill him, for reasons that remain unclear, perhaps because he was obviously injured, perhaps because they wanted a prisoner for propaganda purposes. The militia captured Durant alive rather than executing him on the spot. Durant would spend 11 days as a prisoner of Mohammed Farah Aidid's militia before being released in a negotiated exchange. He would be the only American survivor from Super 64. He survived because Gary Gordon and Randy Shughart bought him 22 minutes with their lives. The Battle of Mogadishu continued for another 16 hours after Gordon and Shughart were killed. The ground convoy lost in the maze of Mogadishu streets, taking heavy casualties, fighting ambushes at every intersection. Didn't reach Super 64's crash site until early morning on October 4th. By the time they arrived, the Somali militia had stripped the helicopter of weapons, equipment, and anything of value. They found the bodies of Raymond Frank, William Cleveland, Thomas Field, Gary Gordon, and Randy Shughart. The casualties from the Battle of Mogadishu were severe on both sides. 18 American soldiers were killed, 13 from Task Force Ranger, 5 from the rescue convoy that eventually extracted the surrounded forces. 73 American soldiers were wounded. 2 Black Hawks were destroyed. Multiple vehicles were lost. Somali casualties were far higher but remain uncertain. Estimates range from 500 to over 1,000 militia fighters and civilians killed. The exact number will never be known. Many wounded were taken away by family members. Many bodies were removed from the streets before official counts could be made. The battle shocked the American public. Images of dead American soldiers being dragged through Mogadishu streets by celebrating crowds appeared on television. The Clinton administration, which had deployed Task Force Ranger with a mission to capture Aidid, faced intense political pressure to withdraw from Somalia. On October 7, 1993, 4 days after the battle, President Clinton announced that all U.S. forces would withdraw from Somalia by March 31, 1994. Mohammed Farah Aidid, the warlord Task Force Ranger had been sent to capture, remained free. The mission had failed politically even though Task Force Ranger had successfully captured 2 of Aidid's lieutenants during the October 3rd raid. But for the soldiers who fought in Mogadishu, the question of whether the mission succeeded or failed was irrelevant compared to the question of whether their brother survived. Mike Durant survived because Gary Gordon and Randy Shughart died defending him. The Army immediately began the process of recommending Gordon and Shughart for the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, awarded for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. The citation for Master Sergeant Gary Ivan Gordon's Medal of Honor reads, Master Sergeant Gordon's extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty were in keeping with the highest standards of military service and reflect great credit upon him, his unit, and the United States Army. On October 3, 1993, Master Sergeant Gordon was part of a sniper team providing protective fire during an assault on a building in Mogadishu, Somalia. When 2 helicopters were shot down, Master Sergeant Gordon, without regard for his personal safety, voluntarily requested to be inserted to protect the crew members at the second crash site. His request was denied twice due to the dangerous situation. On his 3rd request, he and another sniper were inserted. After their insertion, Master Sergeant Gordon and his fellow sniper moved approximately 100 meters to the crash site. After their insertion, Master Sergeant Gordon and his fellow sniper moved to the downed helicopter and established a perimeter defense. Despite being critically low on ammunition and wounded, Master Sergeant Gordon continued to engage the enemy to protect his comrades. Master Sergeant Gordon continued to defend his comrades even after he had been fatally wounded. His actions saved the pilot's life. The citation for Sergeant First Class Randall David Shughart's Medal of Honor is nearly identical. Sergeant First Class Shughart's extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty were in keeping with the highest standards of military service and reflect great credit upon him, his unit, and the United States Army. On October 3, 1993, Sergeant First Class Shughart was part of a sniper team providing protective fire during an assault on a building in Mogadishu, Somalia. When 2 helicopters were shot down, Sergeant First Class Shughart, without regard for his personal safety, voluntarily requested to be inserted to protect the crew members at the second crash site. His request was denied twice due to the dangerous situation. On his third request, he and another sniper were inserted. After their insertion, Sergeant First Class Shughart and his team leader moved to the downed helicopter and established a perimeter defense. Despite being critically low on ammunition and wounded, Sergeant First Class Shughart continued to engage the enemy to protect his comrades. Sergeant First Class Shughart continued to pull the pilot back into the helicopter and place his own body between the pilot and the oncoming militia. His actions saved the pilot's life. Both citations understate the reality of what Gordon and Shughart did. The phrase voluntarily requested doesn't capture the fact that they requested 4 times, knowing each time that they were asking permission to die. The phrase critically low on ammunition doesn't convey that they were 2 men fighting hundreds with 200 rounds total. The phrase continue to engage the enemy doesn't describe fighting until you run out of ammunition, then drawing a knife and fighting hand-to-hand until you're killed. Military citations are written in formal, understated language. The truth is always more violent, more desperate, more heroic than the official version. On May 23, 1994, President Bill Clinton presented the Medal of Honor to the families of Gary Gordon and Randy Shughart in a White House ceremony. Carmen Gordon received her husband's medal. Stephanie Shughart received her husband's medal. Both women had young children who would grow up without their fathers. Clinton's remarks during the ceremony acknowledged the impossible decision Gordon and Shughart had made. They were told the situation was too dangerous. They were told to wait. They asked again. They were told no. They asked a third time. They were told no. Finally, on the 4th request, they were told yes, and they knew what yes meant. They knew they were going to die. They went anyway because a fellow soldier needed help, and that's what you do. The Battle of Mogadishu had profound effects on American military doctrine and special operations tactics. The Army conducted extensive after-action reviews, analyzing what went wrong and how to prevent similar disasters in future urban operations. Several critical lessons emerged. Lesson 1. Urban warfare requires overwhelming force and redundant planning. Task Force Ranger had operated successfully for months using minimal force and speed to achieve surprise. But urban environments favor the defender. A competent enemy can mass forces quickly, set ambushes, and use terrain to neutralize technological advantages. The Rangers and Delta operators were superbly trained, but 160 men cannot fight thousands indefinitely. Lesson 2. Air support alone cannot win urban battles. The Black Hawks and Little Birds provided close air support throughout the battle, but helicopters are vulnerable to ground fire in urban environments. The Somali militia learned that RPGs could shoot down helicopters, and they exploited that vulnerability. Future operations would require armored vehicles and heavy weapons, resources Task Force Ranger lacked in Mogadishu. Lesson 3. Communications and coordination are critical. The ground convoy got lost multiple times during the battle because they were navigating unfamiliar streets under fire. Better GPS technology, better maps, better communication between air and ground units might have prevented some confusion. Lesson 4. Expect the enemy to adapt. The Somali militia learned from each Task Force Ranger raid. By October 3rd, they had developed effective tactics. Mass forces quickly, use RPGs against helicopters, create kill zones and intersections, use civilians as shields. Underestimating the enemy's ability to learn and adapt was a critical error. But the most important lesson, the one that every special operations soldier who studies Mogadishu understands, is that courage and skill sometimes aren't enough. Gordon and Shughart were among the most highly trained soldiers in the world. They had every advantage in training, equipment, and tactical proficiency. They still died because 2 men cannot defeat hundreds, no matter how skilled they are. What they could do, what they did do, was buy time. 22 minutes. Long enough for Mike Durant to survive until rescue arrived the next morning. In the special operations community, Gordon and Shughart became legends. Their decision to insert at Super 64 is taught at every special operations election course, every leadership school, every advanced tactics class. It's the ultimate example of what the military calls selfless service, putting the mission and your comrades above your own survival. But it's also a cautionary tale. Gordon and Shughart made a decision that saved one life at the cost of 2 lives. The arithmetic doesn't favor that trade. From a purely tactical perspective, losing 2 Delta operators to save 1 pilot is a bad exchange. Delta operators are far more difficult to replace than pilots, and Gordon and Shughart's skills were irreplaceable. Yet no one who knows the story questions their decision, because the military doesn't operate on purely tactical arithmetic. It operates on principles. You don't leave men behind. You don't let brothers die alone when you have the ability to help them. You accept risks to yourself to protect others, even when the tactical math says you shouldn't. Gordon and Shughart understood those principles perfectly. They also understood the likely outcome of their decision. They went anyway. Mike Durant never forgot what Gordon and Shughart did for him. After his release from captivity and recovery from his injuries, Durant continued serving in the Army, eventually retiring as a Chief Warrant Officer 4. He wrote a memoir, In the Company of Heroes, that detailed the Battle of Mogadishu from his perspective. In every interview Durant has given about October 3rd, 1993, he emphasizes the same point. I'm alive because Gary Gordon and Randy Shughart gave their lives for me. They knew they were going to die. They came anyway. I think about that every single day. Durant named his son after Randy Shughart. He visits Gordon's and Shughart's graves regularly. He speaks to military audiences about their sacrifice. He has spent 30 years trying to honor the men who saved his life by ensuring their story is never forgotten. The families of Gary Gordon and Randy Shughart have also worked to preserve their memory. The Gary I. Gordon Elementary School in Lincoln, Maine, is named in Gordon's honor. The Shughart-Gordon Memorial at Fort Benning, Georgia, commemorates both men. Their names appear on memorials at Fort Bragg, now Fort Liberty, North Carolina, where Delta Force is headquartered. But perhaps the most fitting memorial is the one that exists in the culture of Special Operations Forces. When operators face impossible situations, when missions require volunteers for near-certain death, when the question is asked who's going in, the example of Gordon and Shughart is invoked. They set a standard. When your brothers need help, you go. You don't calculate the odds. You don't wait for a better option. You go, knowing you might die because that's what the job requires. The Battle of Mogadishu influenced American foreign policy for years afterward. The images of dead American soldiers being dragged through Mogadishu streets created what became known as the Mogadishu effect, a reluctance to commit U.S. ground forces to humanitarian interventions or peacekeeping operations where casualties were likely. When genocide erupted in Rwanda in 1994, just 6 months after Mogadishu, the Clinton administration refused to intervene militarily, citing concerns about another Somalia. An estimated 800,000 people were killed in the Rwandan genocide, while the international community watched from a distance. When ethnic cleansing began in Bosnia in the mid-1990s, the U.S. initially limited its involvement to airstrikes, avoiding ground combat. Only after years of atrocities did NATO deploy ground forces to the Balkans. The Mogadishu effect persisted for nearly a decade. Only after September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks did American willingness to accept casualties in foreign operations return, and even then with significant public debate about the costs. Somalia itself descended into further chaos after the U.S. withdrawal. Mohammed Farah aided continued fighting rival warlords until his death in 1996, killed in street fighting in Mogadishu. Somalia remained a failed state, eventually becoming a haven for terrorist organizations, including Al-Shabaab. As of 2024, Somalia is still struggling with instability, piracy, terrorism, and humanitarian crises. The mission that Task Force Ranger was sent to accomplish, stabilizing Somalia by capturing aided, failed completely. 31 years after the Battle of Mogadishu, Somalia remains one of the most dangerous and unstable countries in the world. But for the men who fought in Mogadishu, the mission's strategic failure doesn't diminish what they accomplished on a personal level. They fought with extraordinary courage against overwhelming odds. They rescued their brothers under fire. They refused to abandon men who needed help, even when helping the men accepting near certain death. Task Force Ranger lost 18 men in Mogadishu. Every one of those deaths was a tragedy. Young men with families, with futures, with so much life ahead of them. But Gary Gordon and Randy Shughart's deaths were different in one crucial respect. They chose their deaths. They volunteered. They knew exactly what they were doing when they jumped from that helicopter. That doesn't make their deaths less tragic, but it does make them profoundly meaningful. In 2001, the book Black Hawk Down by journalist Mark Bowden was adapted into a film directed by Ridley Scott. The film brought the Battle of Mogadishu to a wider audience, depicting the 18-hour battle in visceral detail. The scene where Gordon and Shughart request permission to insert at the crash site, for times, each request denied until the fourth, is one of the film's most powerful moments. The actors who portrayed Gordon and Shughart, Nikolai Coster-Waldau Gordon and Johnny Strong Shughart, both met with the families and studied extensively to portray the men accurately. The film's depiction of their final stand, while necessarily compressed for dramatic purposes, captures the essential truth. Two men fought hundreds, ran out of ammunition, and died defending a position they knew they couldn't hold. The film ends with a title card. Gary Gordon and Randy Shughart were posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. They were the first soldiers to receive the Medal of Honor since the Vietnam War. That final detail is significant. The Medal of Honor is not awarded lightly. It requires actions that are clearly above and beyond the call of duty, actions so extraordinary that they stand apart from the already exceptional courage that combat requires. Gordon and Shughart's actions met that standard because they made a decision that no one could have required them to make. They volunteered for certain death. Not probable death. Not highly likely death. Certain death. They knew the mathematics. They knew the outcome. They went anyway. In the 31 years since the Battle of Mogadishu, military historians, tacticians, and ethicists have analyzed Gordon and Shughart's decision from every angle. Some argue they made the right choice. Saving Durant's life justified the risk. Others argue they made a noble but tactically unsound choice. Losing two irreplaceable Delta operators to save one pilot was a bad trade from a military effectiveness standpoint. Both arguments miss the essential point. Gordon and Shughart didn't make a tactical decision. They made a moral decision. They saw a fellow soldier in danger. They had the ability to help. They chose to help, knowing the cost. Whether that decision was tactically sound is almost irrelevant. What matters is that they made it freely, with full knowledge of consequences, because their values demanded it. The Delta Force community, a tight-knit group of operators who rarely speak publicly about their work, holds Gordon and Shughart in the highest regard. Their names are invoked whenever operators discuss what it means to be part of the unit. They represent the ideal that Delta aspires to, absolute commitment to the mission and each other, regardless of personal cost. But they're also a reminder of the price that ideal sometimes requires. Delta operators sign up knowing they might be asked to do impossible things. They train for years to be ready for those moments. And sometimes, being ready means accepting that you won't come home. Carmen Gordon, Gary's widow, has spoken occasionally about her husband's decision. In a 2001 interview, she said, "Gary knew what he was doing. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He saw someone who needed help, and he had the ability to help. So he did. That was Gary. That was who he was. I'm proud of what he did, even though I wish he was still here." Stephanie Shughart, Randy's widow, has been less public but has expressed similar sentiments. Randy didn't seek glory. He did his job. His job that day was helping Mike Durant survive. He did his job. Both women raised their children alone. Both families paid a price for Gordon and Shughart's decision that continues decades later. The Medal of Honor doesn't change that. The memorials don't change that. The respect and admiration of a grateful nation don't change that. Gary Gordon and Randy Shughart gave everything. Their families gave everything. And Mike Durant lived. That's the trade. That's what it cost. In 2003, the U.S. Navy commissioned two ships named in honor of Gordon and Shughart. The USNS Gordon and the USNS Shughart, both Lewis and Clark-class cargo ships. The ships serve logistical roles, supplying combat forces deployed overseas. It's a fitting memorial. Gordon and Shughart spent their careers in support roles, snipers providing overwatch, protecting others, enabling the mission. Even in death, ships bearing their names continue that mission, supporting American forces around the world. At Fort Benning, Georgia, home of the 75th Ranger Regiment, the Shughart-Gordon Range is used to train Rangers in marksmanship. Every Ranger who qualifies on that range learns about the men it's named for. They learn about October 3rd, 1993. They learn about the decision Gordon and Shughart made. And they understand that someday they might face a similar decision. They might be asked or might volunteer to do something that has no good outcome, only a choice between bad options and worse options. When that moment comes, they have an example to follow. The final word on Gary Gordon and Randy Shughart belongs to the men who serve with them. Delta Force operators rarely give interviews. They rarely speak publicly about their missions or their fallen comrades. But in the few accounts that exist from operators who knew Gordon and Shughart, a consistent theme emerges. They were quiet professionals. They didn't seek attention. They did their jobs with extraordinary skill. They took care of their teammates. And when the moment came that defined their entire lives, the moment when they had to choose between safety and service, they chose service without hesitation. One Delta operator, speaking anonymously about Gordon and Shughart, put it simply, they did what any of us would have done. They saw brothers in trouble. They went to help. That's the standard. That's what we do. Gary and Randy didn't do anything special. They just did their jobs when it mattered most. That self-effacing description is typical of the special operations community, but it's also misleading. What Gordon and Shughart did was special precisely because it exemplified the standard so perfectly. The standard says you go when brothers need help. Gordon and Shughart went when going meant dying. That's not ordinary. That's extraordinary. On October 3rd, every year, the Special Operations Community observes a memorial for those who died in Mogadishu. 18 names are read aloud. 18 lives are remembered. But 2 of those names, Gary Ivan Gordon and Randall David Shughart, carry special weight. They represent a choice that every warrior hopes they have the courage to make if the moment comes. They represent a standard of selfless service that inspires and humbles in equal measure. They represent the very best of what it means to be a soldier. 31 years after the Battle of Mogadishu, Mike Durant is still alive. He has children and grandchildren who exist because Gary Gordon and Randy Shughart bought him 22 minutes with their lives. The math is simple. 2 lives given, 1 life saved, dozens of lives created by that one saved life continuing. But the meaning is more complex. Because Gordon and Shughart didn't just save Mike Durant's life. They reaffirmed the principle that the military cannot function without, that we don't abandon each other, that we go into danger for our brothers, that some things are worth dying for. They prove that courage isn't the absence of fear or the miscalculation of odds. Courage is seeing the odds clearly, understanding the cost completely, and choosing to pay that cost anyway because your values demand it. Gary Gordon and Randy Shughart died in a failed mission, in a failed intervention, in a country that remains a disaster 3 decades later. The strategic value of their sacrifice is 0. Somalia didn't stabilize. American policy didn't improve. The world didn't become safer. But Mike Durant lived, and the principle they died defending, that you don't leave men behind, survive intact. And every special operations soldier who has served since Mogadishu knows that if they go down in a bad spot, someone will come for them. Because Gordon and Shughart set the standard. They showed what right looks like when right means dying. That's their legacy. Not the medals, not the memorials, not the ships or the ranges or the schools named in their honor. Their legacy is the knowledge that when the moment comes, when brothers need help and helping them means dying, there are men who will go anyway. Gary Gordon and Randy Shughart went. They gave everything. And Mike Durant lived. Rest in peace. Warriors. Mission accomplished.